67% of children's calories now are ultra-processed foods. These means foods that come from a factory made by food scientists. Not just processed, ultra-processed. The highest form of processing, 67% of calories. Then you go to the 1970s and we have the advent of high fructose corn syrup, which, as Callie talks about, this preceded some of the mergers, but high fructose corn syrup is a weapon of mass destruction that basically food scientists used an understanding about hibernating animals like bears who fructose is one of the only types of calories where instead of making you feel satiated, it makes you more hungry. And this is evolutionarily, and we knew this. In the fall, when animals are preparing for hibernation and they start eating fructose-rich berries, they need to put on a ton of fat for winter. And so there's a feed-forward mechanism with fructose where it actually gets the bears to be hungry and even violent to outcompete other animals to get as many berries as possible in a short period of time to lay 3D print fat for winter. So you have the scientists understanding this and say, hey, we can make liquid fructose 1,000 times more potent than the fructose you'd find in berries. Same molecule, but in higher concentration. And we can add it to everything. We can add it to salad dressing. We're going to add it to ketchup. We're going to add it to children's school lunches. We're going to add it obviously to sodas, and we're going to make people insatiable. We're going to make their bodies and their brains think that they're preparing for winter that's never coming. And there has been research that shows that high fructose corn syrup is associated with violence, ADHD in kids, all of these different things. Just last thing I'll mention, flash forward 1986, I think another very important date, which is the date when the litigation went through that said we couldn't sue vaccine manufacturers. And the Vaccine Safety Act, that's a very important date in the whole history because it is one of the first times where we were able to pass legislation through Congress that said that pharmaceutical companies could not be sued for wrongdoing. And that still is present today. They basically put together a paltry little fund that people could apply to get no fault reimbursements for vaccine harm, but you cannot sue the company. So you start to get companies being legally immune from wrongdoing, which has then accelerated, and they're now starting to try and push things like that for pesticides as well. So that's just some of the history of like why we are where we are today. It's not rocket science. This has all been very institutionalized and structured, and it's the last 50 years. Like, we can undo all of this with leadership. And so that's just a little bit of the picture of how we are where we are today.
And can I just say one thing about the fructose corn syrup? I'm so glad you brought that up because I didn't know that there was a unique way that it makes it more addictive and kills your satiety.
Oh, yeah.
Or increases it, or kills it rather. Because I'd always thought that sugar was sugar. And this is one of the arguments that a lot of people that are poo-pooing all this stuff, like, oh, this is nonsense, sugar is sugar.
Yeah.
Like, there's no difference between the sugar in high fructose corn syrup versus the sugar in an apple.
No, it's really interesting. There's two amazing books on this. Richard Johnson from University of Colorado wrote Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and then David Perlmutter wrote Drop Acid. Both books are about a molecule called uric acid, which is unique to fructose metabolism. So when fructose is metabolized in the body, not like glucose, it creates uric acid, which creates oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction in the brain and the body, that if you have mitochondrial dysfunction, you're not going to be able to process sugars to energy, mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. So you break the mitochondria with the excess fructose, overloading the mitochondria with uric acid. And then what happens? You can't turn sugars to energy. So what do? You turn sugars to fat. So you start 3D printing fat because you break the mitochondria with excess fructose. And on top of that, the mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress when happening in the brain is what may inspire the violence and the ADHD and all that stuff to make the bears manic so they get as much berries as possible. This is what's happening in every kid in every classroom in America now. And so that's kind of some of the biology very simply about what's happening with fructose.
So the apple is probably a bad example, but like cane sugar. Is cane sugar fructose based?
Well, it's generally is going to have sucrose, which is going to have some amount of glucose and fructose. But this is the thing about fruit, is that we have 40 trillion cells, and we have the ability to clear uric acid, and we have the ability to process fructose in a physiologic amount. We're never going to have the uric acid increasing and overloading the mitochondria if we're eating an apple. It's when you're eating 20, 30 times the fructose that an apple has, and you're literally pouring it down, that all of a sudden, imagine you get this huge rise in uric acid in the body and other things that are happening. And that's when it overwhelms. So it's a bit of that dose makes the poison, because our body has the ability to excrete toxins. Our body has the ability to deal with some heavy metals. Our body has the ability to probably clear some level of glyphosate, but we can't clear all of it all the time, 24 hours a day, in 100 times the quantity of all these things together. And the research and the evidence-based thing and this cult of the science, they love to ignore that. The idea of synergistic effects of this overwhelming breaking of our cellular resources is just conveniently forgotten because we study things in isolation. That's literally the definition of how a double-blind, placebo-controlled study happens. It's one variable, and one thing that you're testing.
You can't do it on food.
That doesn't make sense. We live in a toxic stew.
The only answer of double-blind placebo-controlled studies, which every guest comes on is just like, that's just the gold standard. That's just, everyone just accepts that that's what you need. A double-blind placebo-controlled study, the only answer is a pill, essentially. You can't test psychedelics on that way. You can't test food. You can't test exercise. You can't blind those things. So anything that actually recognizes the unison and the interconnectivity of why we're getting sick can't be studied through a double-blind placebo-controlled study. You actually have the FDA that's basically created. You saw this with the recent MDMA decision. It's basically rigged that the only thing that can be approved through the top way we study things and approve drugs is a synthetic pill. That's the only thing that it can basically lead to through a double-blind placebo-controlled study.
It's like with vaccines. It's like, yeah, I bet that one vaccine probably isn't causing autism. But what about the 20 that they're getting before 18 months? Like, we don't look at it in synergistic, and so that's a big problem. And this is where the cult of the science, and I say the science specifically because science is beautiful. Using the scientific method and using that way of inquiry into the natural world is a beautiful art. But weaponizing papers that are often bought for or corrupted, and the leaders of some of our key medical journals have actually even said that 50% of scientific research that published ends up being wrong. So it's bought for, corrupted, or wrong. We rely on this, and one interesting trend that we're seeing in our world is that if we do choose to put dots together or use our intuition, our God-given intuition, anything other than this particular way of examining things, you are dangerous. You are dangerous. And I think that that's something we need to really question. I think, especially as a woman, and I'm thinking about having kids soon, I'm thinking about wow, I have the ability in my body to build a human, 3D print a human,